December 1944. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The train doors rattled open, and 57 Japanese prisoners stepped onto frozen ground, blinking against winter light they never thought they'd see. They had surrendered expecting bullets. Instead, they smelled meat cooking. Rich, fatty, impossibly abundant meat. One soldier whispered to another, "This must be the prelude to execution." But the guards didn't raise their rifles. They pointed toward the barracks. And in that moment, standing in the snow with empty stomachs and hollowed cheeks, the prisoners realized something more terrifying than death awaited them, the collapse of everything they'd been told about their enemy. Before we continue, if you're finding this story as gripping as we do, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these untold chapters of history. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from, whether it's Tokyo, Texas, or anywhere in between. These stories deserve to be remembered, and your support keeps them alive. They had been taught since their first day in uniform that capture was worse than death. Surrender stripped a man of honor, reduced him to nothing in the eyes of the emperor and his ancestors. The Imperial Army drilled this into every recruit. Americans were barbaric, lawless, motivated only by cruelty. Prisoners would be starved, tortured, humiliated until they begged for mercy that would never come. So, when these men, skeletal survivors of Saipan, Guadalcanal, and the collapsing Pacific Front, finally raised their hands in defeat, they braced for the end. What they got instead was a medical exam, a wool blanket, and a bowl of soup thicker than anything they'd eaten in 2 years. The contrast was immediate and disorienting. At intake, American medics inspected wounds with the same care they'd give their own soldiers. A Japanese private with a festering arm injury sat frozen as a corpsman cleaned and dressed it, speaking softly in English he couldn't understand. The prisoner had expected to be ignored, left to rot. Instead, he received gauze, antiseptic, and a tab of aspirin. He stared at the bandage afterward, unable to reconcile the act with the image of savagery burned into his mind. Red Cross officials moved through the lines with clipboards, ensuring procedures followed the Geneva Convention. The prisoners had heard of these rules, but never believed they'd apply to them. Why would the enemy bother? Inside the barracks, the men tested their bunks cautiously, as though the mattresses might vanish if touched too hard. Stoves radiated heat. Blankets, though plain, were thick and clean. It was captivity. Yes, barbed wire framed every window, but it was nothing like the degradation they'd been promised. That first night, whispers ran through the rows of cots. "Do you think they're fattening us for something worse?" one man asked. Another replied, "Or perhaps, this is simply how they live." The next morning, the prisoners were gathered for orientation. A Red Cross representative, speaking through a Japanese-American interpreter, outlined their rights. They would be fed, housed, allowed to write home, permitted to work under fair conditions. They would not be abused. The words felt like a trap. One soldier muttered, "They speak of rules as if we are still human." Another shook his head. "Maybe to them we are." Then came the medical evaluations more thorough than any exam they'd received in the Imperial Army. Doctors weighed them, checked their teeth, measured blood pressure. Many came in under 90 pounds. The American physicians shook their heads quietly, noting malnutrition in every file. But there was no mockery, no contempt, just efficiency and something stranger, concern. Vitamins were distributed, small chalky tablets the prisoners didn't recognize. Medicine for enemies. The absurdity of it stung worse than any insult. By afternoon, they were issued fresh uniforms marked with PW in bold letters. The clothes fit better than the rags they'd arrived in. Some men hesitated before putting them on, as though each stitch represented a surrender deeper than the battlefield. Others simply welcomed the warmth. Wisconsin's wind cut through the camp with a brutality all its own, and for the first time in months, they weren't shivering. The guards themselves defied expectations. Yes, they carried rifles. Yes, they enforced order. But there were no beatings for moving too slowly, no spitting, no casual cruelty. When an older prisoner stumbled on an icy path, a guard reached down and pulled him upright without a word, then continued on. It was a small gesture, almost meaningless, but to men who had braced for dehumanization, it was profoundly confusing. That night, as the prisoners lay under their new blankets, the smell from the kitchens drifted through the camp again. Thick, smoky, fatty. Stomachs growled involuntarily, betraying hunger they'd tried to suppress. One man pressed his face into his pillow to block it out. Another whispered, "Tomorrow, maybe the mask comes off. Maybe tomorrow we see the truth." But tomorrow came, and the routine held. Roll call, work assignments, and then the moment that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, the mess hall. The line moved slowly, boots scraping against the concrete floor. Steam rose from behind the counter, carrying a scent so foreign that many couldn't identify it. It wasn't fish. It wasn't rice. It was something heavier, richer, closer to luxury than survival. The prisoners clutched their tin trays, eyes darting nervously. Perhaps this was where the humiliation would begin. Perhaps scraps would be thrown at them, spoiled food ladled out with laughter. Then the first man stepped forward. An American cook, sleeves rolled to his elbows, dropped a seared patty onto a soft bun with a spatula. He added a handful of golden fried potatoes. Then he reached for a glass bottle, sweating with condensation, popped the cap and slid it onto the tray. The red script on the label was unfamiliar, almost decorative. The prisoner stared at the tray as though it were a mirage. His hands trembled. "Move along," the cook said flatly. Behind him, others leaned forward, whispering, "Meat. They're giving us meat." When more trays began to fill, disbelief deepened. The bun was soft to the touch. The potatoes were hot, salted, fried in real fat. And the bottle Coca-Cola, a guard explained, curtly fizzed as though alive. The prisoners sat at long wooden tables, staring at the food like men who had stumbled into forbidden territory. One soldier brought the bottle to his lips. Sweetness exploded first, then the burn of carbonation. He coughed, eyes watering. Another laughed a sharp, uncontrolled burst that startled everyone around him. A third man covered his mouth, shoulders shaking, caught between laughter and tears. A thin prisoner, ribs visible even under his new uniform, lifted the hamburger with both hands. He sniffed it. Then he bit in. Grease ran down his chin. He froze, chewing slowly as though each bite might vanish if he moved too quickly. Then he lowered his face, hiding the tears that welled up. "Are you all right?" his bunkmate asked quietly. The man swallowed hard. "I had forgotten the taste of fat." At another table, two prisoners debated in hushed tones. "They want to make us weak," one argued. "They fatten us so we forget our cause." Or, his companion said slowly, "They simply eat like this every day." That idea was harder to swallow than the food itself. The mess hall filled with low sounds, chewing, muffled laughter, an occasional sob quickly hidden. For men who had lived through the starvation of Guadalcanal, the collapsing supply lines of Saipan, and the hunger of a Japan already losing the war, this meal was more than nourishment. It was an assault on their assumptions. One prisoner later whispered to his bunkmate that the sweetness of the Coca-Cola felt like a dream gone wrong, too gentle to belong in war. The Americans serving the food noticed nothing extraordinary. To them, it was routine. They ate the same hamburger and fries, washed it down with the same bottle of Coke, and thought nothing of it. For the guards and cooks, feeding prisoners was procedure. But for the prisoners themselves, it was as if they had crossed into another reality. What shook them most was not the abundance, but the normalcy of it all. The Americans were not celebrating. They were not taunting. This was not a feast meant to impress. It was simply Tuesday dinner. That contrast hit harder than any insult could have. Here were men who had fought ferociously, who had been told that America was starving, decadent, on the brink of collapse. Yet, in captivity, they were eating better than they had as free soldiers of the Empire. The shame was sharp, but the relief was sharper still. By the time trays were emptied and bottles stood drained on the tables, the prisoners sat back in silence. Some folded their hands as if in prayer. Others stared blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. The mess hall guards called for order, ushering the men back to their barracks. The prisoners filed out, still stunned, still whispering among themselves about what they had tasted. That night, lying on bunks under wool blankets, the memory of the hamburger and Coca-Cola stayed with them, not just as food, but as proof. Proof that their enemy lived in a different world, one where sweetness could be wasted on prisoners, one where meat was so common it could be shaped into patties and handed out without thought. But food was only the beginning. Over the weeks that followed, the prisoners settled into a routine that tested everything they thought they knew. Each morning, roll call. Work assignments: shoveling snow, cutting wood, helping on nearby farms under guard supervision. The work was steady, not brutal. They were even paid small wages in camp coupons, which could be exchanged at the canteen for toiletries, writing paper, candy, or cigarettes. One afternoon, a Japanese soldier held up a chocolate bar he had purchased with his coupons. His hands trembled as he unwrapped it. "In Japan," he murmured, "this is medicine. Here they give it away to soldiers like it is nothing." His friend shook his head in disbelief. What kind of nation can afford this? The canteen itself was another shock. Prisoners watched American soldiers come and go, chatting casually, buying Coke or chewing gum, joking with the clerk. The casualness of it was almost unbearable. War was raging in Europe and the Pacific, yet here in Wisconsin, Americans seemed to live as though abundance would never run dry. Still, the daily structure of camp life began to press down in a different way. There was no fighting, no advancing, no dying comrades to bury. Instead, there was monotony. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. The mind, once consumed by survival, now had space to wander, and with wandering came longing. Letters became lifelines. The camp allowed each prisoner to write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month, heavily censored but still precious. Men hunched over tables, scratching out words with pencils, trying to capture their homes in ink. "I am alive" was often all they could manage. Some received letters back thin envelopes with kanji written in familiar hands. Others received none. For those men, silence grew heavier with each passing week. English classes were offered in the evenings. A few curious prisoners attended, repeating words slowly after the American teacher. Bread, table, window. Others scoffed, insisting there was no use in learning the enemy's tongue. But even the skeptics listened from their bunks, ears pricking at the strange rhythm of the words. There were moments of unexpected contact. A guard at a worksite once asked a prisoner, "Do you miss rice?" The interpreter relayed the question. The prisoner laughed bitterly and answered in Japanese, "Rice is a memory." When the reply was translated, the guard grew quiet, perhaps realizing the weight behind the words. Not all interactions were so gentle. Suspicion lingered. Some guards treated the prisoners with cold precision, never speaking beyond orders. Inside the barracks, tempers flared. Some men still clung to faith in Japan's victory. Others, seeing the war unravel, whispered that defeat was certain. One night, 2 argued so loudly a guard intervened. "You dishonor our homeland," shouted one. "And you dishonor reason," snapped the other. The guard silenced them, but the division lingered. Even in the heart of America, the war lived inside their minds. Yet daily life settled into routines. Men carved toys from scrap wood, played makeshift games, or told stories of home. 3 meals a day, simple, steady, almost unthinkable after the chaos of the Pacific. At night, silence fell quickly, broken only by a whispered question. "What do you think your family eats tonight?" The answers never came. Camp McCoy was neither freedom nor cruelty. It was something in between a limbo where bodies endured, but meaning blurred. Over time, both sides discovered small, inexplicable connections. Language became the first bridge. Few Japanese spoke English, and most guards knew no Japanese. Orders came through gestures. One day, a guard barked, "Work." A prisoner echoed softly, "Waku." Laughter rippled through the group, the first shared sound of humanity. During an English lesson, the teacher wrote family on the chalkboard. A prisoner hesitated, then said, "Family." The class laughed, not mockery, but warmth. Even the teacher smiled. In that moment, enemy became simply man. Food formed another fragile bond. Guards sometimes shared cigarettes or gum. One prisoner swallowed his gum whole, and the Americans roared with laughter. Soon, gum became a small ritual, a guard offering, a prisoner bowing stiffly in thanks. But not every encounter was kind. On a farm outside the camp, an American farmer whose son had died in the Pacific spat near a prisoner's feet. The guard said nothing but stepped closer, silent witness to the hatred still alive beyond the wire. "Some Americans follow their rules," a prisoner muttered later. "Some do not." Inside the camp, friendship sometimes grew where it shouldn't. A young guard named Miller carried photographs of his family. He showed them to prisoners who gathered near the fence faces they couldn't understand but recognized all the same. In the dirt, the men sketched their own homes. "Mother," Miller said, pointing at his picture. A prisoner touched his chest and answered softly, "Ha ha ha." The word bridged oceans before another guard barked for silence. Still, loyalty ran deep. Some prisoners warned others against softening. English lessons, shared laughter, even gum these, they said, corroded honor. One man wrote secretly in his diary, "We were told Americans were animals, yet they share their food and heal our wounds." Which is the lie? For many, kindness cut deeper than cruelty. "They feed us better than our families eat," one whispered. "How can we bear it?" Warm stoves and wool blankets only deepened guilt. Letters from home spoke of starvation. The contrast became unbearable. "I eat like a soldier," one man said quietly, "while my children starve." Propaganda crumbled under daily reality. The men had been taught that America was decadent, hollow. Yet here even prisoners drank Coca-Cola and smoked cigarettes. "This is Wisconsin," one guard said with a grin. "You should see Illinois." The prisoner lowered his eyes, ashamed of envy. Some men broke under the contradictions. "I believed Japan was the center of the world," one confessed in the dark. "Now I see we are only one small island." The thought frightened even him. During Red Cross inspections, they told the truth that they were treated well, then sat in silence afterward, ashamed. "We admit our enemy shows mercy," one said bitterly. "What does that make us?" One snowy afternoon, a group of American children approached the work fence. A small girl offered a candy bar through the wire. The prisoner froze, then took it with a bow. That night, he whispered, "A child of the enemy fed me." Such moments blurred the line between pride and gratitude. By 1945, the camp's rhythms felt almost normal. Hunger no longer carved their faces. They wrote letters, learned halting English, and even smiled at guards. But guilt remained. Rumors from home bombings, hunger, loss tightened around every word of kindness. Then the war outside reached its end. Whispers of atomic bombs spread faster than guards could silence them. When Japan surrendered, disbelief gave way to grief. Some wept quietly under their blankets. Others sat in stunned silence. The guards offered no mockery, only routine. "They treat us the same," one man said bitterly, "even in defeat." Preparations for repatriation began. The prisoners received clean uniforms, medical checks, and brief instructions for return. On departure morning, they marched out carrying small bundles, wooden carvings, letters, bits of the strange world that had held them. Passing through the gates, many looked back once. The place they had feared had given them warmth, food, and even fragments of understanding. The voyage home was heavy with silence. What will we find? They wondered. Japan was in ruins. Families scattered. Hunger worse than before. "We will be called cowards," one said. "But we lived." Another whispered, "I cannot forget the taste of bread." When they stepped onto Japanese soil, the devastation stunned them. Cities leveled, families gaunt. Some met wives and children alive but hollow-eyed. Others met no one. A few tried to speak of their time in America, of hamburgers, blankets, guards who smiled, but most stayed silent. The stories did not fit the nation's grief. Years later, one former prisoner told his son, "I learned in America that kindness is harder to carry than cruelty. Cruelty you can resist. Kindness stays with you." The legacy of Camp McCoy lay not in victory or defeat, but in those small, unsettling exchanges: a photograph, a shared cigarette, a child's candy bar. Within barbed wire, men discovered that even in war, humanity flickers where it's least expected. Mercy, they learned, can wound deeper than hatred, but it also endures longer.